But Peter stayed outside at the door. So the other disciple, the high priest's acquaintance, went back and spoke to the girl on duty at the door, and brought Peter in. The girl said to Peter, "Are you another of this man's disciples?" "I am not," he said. As it was cold, the servants and the police had made a charcoal fire, and were standing around it, warming themselves. Peter, too, was standing with them, sharing the warmth. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus replied, "I have spoken openly, all the world to hear. I have always taught in synagogues or in the temple where all Jews congregate. I have said nothing in secret. Why are you questioning me? Question those who heard me. They know what I said." When he said this, one of the police standing near him struck him in the face. "Is that the way to answer the high priest?" he demanded. Jesus replied, "If I was wrong to speak what I did, produce evidence to prove it. If I was right, why strike me?" So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "Are you another of his disciples?" But he denied it. "I am not," he said. One of the high priest's servants, a relation of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, insisted, "Did I not see you with him in the garden?" Once again Peter denied it, and at that moment a cock crowed. From Caiaphas, Jesus was led into the governor's headquarters. It was now early morning, and the Jews themselves stayed outside the headquarters to avoid defilement, so they could eat the Passover meal. So Pilate came out to him and asked, "What charge do you bring against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "would we not have brought him before you?" Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and try him by your own law." But the Jews answered, "We are not allowed to put anyone to death." Thus they ensured the fulfillment of the words by which Jesus had indicated the kind of death he was to die. Pilate then went back into his headquarters and summoned Jesus. "So you are the king of the Jews," he said. Jesus replied, "Is that your own question, or have others suggested it to you?" "Am I a Jew?" said Pilate. "Your own nation and their chief priests have brought you before me. What have you done?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If it did, my followers would be fighting to save me from the clutches of the Jews. My kingdom belongs elsewhere." "You are a king, then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "King is your word. My task is to bear witness to the truth. For this I was born. For this I came into the world, and all who are not deaf to truth listen to my voice." Pilate said, "What is truth?" With those words he went out again to the Jews and said, For my part, I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release one prisoner for you at Passover. Would you like me to release the king of the Jews?" At this they shouted back, "Not him, we want Barabbas." Barabbas was a bandit. Pilate now took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and placed it on his head, and robed him in a purple cloak. Then one after another they came up to him, crying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him on the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Here he is. I am bringing him out to let you know that I find no case against him." And Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple cloak. "Here is the man," said Pilate. At the sight of him, the chief priests and the temple police shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" "Take him yourselves and crucify him," said Pilate. "For my part, I find no case against him." The Jews answered, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has claimed to be God's son." When Pilate heard that, he was more afraid than ever. Going back into his headquarters, he asked Jesus, "Where have you come from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" said Pilate. "Surely you know that I have the authority to release you and authority to crucify you." "You would have no authority at all over me," Jesus replied, "if I had not been granted to you from above. And therefore the deeper guilt lies with the one who handed me over to you." From that moment, Pilate tried hard to release him. But the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend to Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king is opposing Caesar." When Pilate heard what they were saying, he brought Jesus out and took his seat on the tribunal, at the place known as the Pavement in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation for the Passover, about noon. Pilate said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They shouted, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" "Am I to crucify your king?" said Pilate. "We have no king but Caesar," replied the chief priests. Then at last, to satisfy them, he handed Jesus over to be crucified. Jesus was taken away and went out, carrying the cross himself, to the place called the Skull, in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus in between. Pilate had an inscription written and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." This inscription in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek was read by many Jews, since the place where Jesus was crucified was not far from the city. So the Jewish chief priest said to Pilate, "You should not write King of the Jews, but rather he claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate replied, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, and leaving aside the tunic, divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. The tunic was seamless, woven in one piece throughout. So they said to one another, "We must not tear this. Let us toss for it." Thus the text of Scripture came true. They shared my garments among them, and cast lots for my clothing. That is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, near the cross on which Jesus hung, his mother was standing with her sister, Mary, wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. Seeing his mother, with the disciple whom he loved, standing beside her, Jesus said to her, "Mother, there is your son." And to the disciple, "There is your mother." And from that moment, the disciple took her into his home. After this, Jesus, aware that all had now come to its appointed end, said in fulfillment of Scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar stood there full of sour wine, so they soaked a sponge with the wine, fixed it on hyssop, and held it up to his lips. Having received the wine, he said, "It is accomplished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Because it was the eve of the Sabbath, the Jews were anxious that the body should not remain on the cross, since the Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they requested Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers accordingly came to the men crucified with Jesus and broke the legs of each in turn. But when they came to Jesus and found he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers thrust a lance into his side, and at once there was a flow of blood and water. This is vouched for by an eyewitness, whose evidence is to be trusted. He knows that he speaks the truth, so that you too may believe. For this happened in fulfillment in the text of Scripture. Not one bone of his shall be broken. Another text says, "They shall look on him whom they pierced." After that, Joseph of Arimathea, a disciple of Jesus, but a secret disciple for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate for permission to remove the body of Jesus. He consented, so Joseph came and removed the body. He was joined by Nicodemus, the man who had visited Jesus by night, who brought with him a mixture of myrrh and aloes, more than 100 weight. They took the body of Jesus, and following Jewish burial customs, they wrapped it with the spices and strips of linen cloth. Near the place where he had been crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, not yet used for burial. And there, since it was the eve of the Jewish Sabbath, and the tomb was near at hand, they laid Jesus. And that is that.
Mom,
I will see you on Sunday morning.
Mom, can you read some more?
We will read more on Sunday morning.
Go confirm. I saw a blue jay.
Oh, that bird feeder. Look at that squirrel hanging on the side.
I dare you be on the bird feeder. Look at the squirrel grass.
There's a rat with a hair.